Good evening. My name is Adam Miles. Welcome to 108 Elemental Presents Your Local Haunts. This week we are visiting the city by the lake, the Windy City, Chi-Town itself, Chicago, Illinois. Founded in 1830 on the banks of Lake Michigan, Chicago quickly grew to become the largest city of the American Midwest. An epicenter of manufacturing, finance, sports, art, and music, Chicago is now a world-class city. However, the history of Chicago is also a story of tragedy, destruction, and violence. A perfect breeding ground for ghost stories. On the morning of July 24th, 1915, the Western Electric Company was set to host its 5th annual employee picnic for families and friends. 5 steamers were hired to ferry the some 7,000 people across Lake Michigan to Michigan City, Indiana. At 6:30 a.m., the first of the steamers, the Eastland, arrived at the pier between Clark Street and LaSalle. Around 2,500 excited passengers began crowding onto the steamer, severely overloading it. As the tug began to move the Eastland from the dock, this became apparent as the steamer began to list slowly toward the dockside. Concerned, people began shifting their weight to right the steamer, which worked for a moment, before the Eastland then listed the opposite way. Cargo slid as people panicked, trapped below decks on the sinking steamer. The people on the upper decks were thrown into the river as the boat capsized, trapping those within. In minutes, it was over and the rescue efforts began. Some were saved, many were not. As the days passed, the picture became more clear and dire. The Eastland Disaster claimed the lives of at least 844 people, more than the Chicago Fire of 1871. To this day, it still ranks as one of the worst maritime disasters in American history. Unfortunately, for many in Chicago, the tragedy continues. For years since the incident, people walking along the Chicago River at night report seeing strange lights hovering over the water and the sounds of people splashing and crying below. Even a few blocks away, where Oprah Winfrey's famous Harpo Studios once stood, stories of ghostly presences persist. On a particular episode in 1996, Oprah even addressed the reports of hauntings in her studios, confirming that she herself believed the studios to be haunted. Most of the witnesses to the Harpo Studio hauntings were the security guards. Many nights, an apparition known as the Gray Lady was caught on security cameras roaming the halls in vintage attire. Unfortunately, every time the ghost was confronted by the security guards, it would vanish into thin air. This haunting, too, it seems, ties into the Eastland Disaster of 1915. You see, in the days that followed the tragedy, the number of bodies recovered quickly overcame the space at the city morgue. Because of this, a makeshift morgue was set up at the 2nd Regiment Illinois National Guard Armory on Carpenter Street. Over the next several days, body after body filled the armory, as did mourners and their desperate cries. In the years that followed, it became evident that the armory was no longer needed, so the property found its way from the public sector to the private. In 1989, the property was bought by Oprah Winfrey, and the Harpo Studios was born, along with the ghost stories and the sightings. One of the most famous of Chicago's hauntings, however, has to be the haunting of the Red Lion Pub on North Lincoln Avenue. Opened in 1984 by English-born John Cordwell, the Red Lion Pub is a British pub in every sense of the word. From the long wooden bar to the literary portraits, the pub has a true public house atmosphere. It is a place for good friends, great drinks, and spectral patrons. What makes this particular pub one of the most haunted in Chicago is the sheer number of witnesses, sightings, and ghosts involved. As most patrons can tell you, the racket that comes from the 2nd floor on some nights is incredible, especially since the 2nd floor is usually empty when the noise begins. From crashing sounds to heavy stomping, the second floor is a busy place for poltergeists. Another room upstairs that has quite a bit of activity is the ladies' washroom. Ear-piercing screams of a woman can be heard some nights coming from the empty restroom. Management has also had issues with the washroom door locking itself from the inside. Perhaps the most active part of the Red Lion pub, however, has to be the top floor and stairwell that seems to be where the poltergeist occurrences happen the most. Over the years, there have been many reports of people being touched and shoved. The reason for the ghosts seems to be as elusive and varied as the haunting themselves. Originally built in 1882, the build that houses the pub has had many faces. From a Greek grocery and apartments to an illegal betting parlor to a Western bar, the building has had a sordid past. From this past come several confirmed deaths and many possibilities. A young woman named Sharon and both her parents died on the second floor when it was apartments. The former owner of the Western bar swore vengeance for an eviction before his death, and who knows what violence happened within the walls of a betting parlor when someone couldn't pay a debt. Whatever the reason, whoever the ghostly patrons, one thing is for sure. If you're looking to have an interesting night in Chi-Town, look no further than the Red Lion on North Lincoln. There's something in the alley near the Biograph Theater, and there has been for a very long time. The alley is considered a bit of a shortcut, and yet it usually stands empty. People pass by without a second glance, and very few of them even realize it. There is something in the alley that people avoid. Something. Someone who has been haunting it since 1934. A man named John Dillinger. During the Depression era, John Dillinger, along with the Outlaws, Babyface Nelson, and Pretty Boy Floyd, waged a war against the bankers. This lashing out at the financial institutions gave the trio a bit of public support. Unfortunately for John Dillinger, he was eventually caught by the authorities and sent to Crown Point in Indiana. Unfortunately for the authorities, Dillinger soon made a very famous escape from the escape-proof jail and headed back to Chicago. Dillinger had many friends on the north side of Chicago who could keep him safe. This protection, combined with a new identity and plastic surgery, gave him a sense of safety that was to be short-lived. The FBI was one deal away from finding him. At the time, John Dillinger was dating a woman named Polly Hamilton, who lived at a rooming house owned by an immigrant named Anna Sage. Sage had her own problems with the authorities because of her brothel-keeping convictions and the threat of being deported. In desperation, Sage cut a deal with the FBI to stay in the country. She would give them Dillinger. The night of July 22, 1934 was a scorcher. So, Dillinger invited Polly and her landlady, Anna Sage, to the picture shows. The Biograph Theater was air-conditioned and playing a gangster film, the perfect place for the trio to cool off. Unfortunately, because of Anna Sage's tip-off, the FBI was waiting. It was just past 10:30 p.m. when Dillinger and company exited the Biograph into the hot night and the path of the FBI. Seeing the authorities, Dillinger took off south towards an alley connecting Halsted to Lincoln. The FBI didn't even hesitate. Bullets riddled Dillinger's body as he reached the alley, dying next to a utility pole. That night, Dillinger cemented himself into legend and cemented his soul to that alley, the alley that everyone avoids. Welcome to Chicago, the city of broad shoulders, the city of restless spirits. Thank you for joining us tonight, and as always, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button. Well, until next time, as always, have a great night. Thank you.